In the world of organized crime, power isn't just about money. It's about control. And for decades, the Italian Mafia controlled the heroin trade in New York City. No one challenged them. No one dared to. Until Frank Lucas came in. Frank Lucas didn't just take on the Mafia. He outplayed them. He built a drug empire worth millions, cutting out middlemen and smuggling pure heroin straight from Southeast Asia. His product, named Blue Magic, was stronger, cheaper, and deadlier than anything on the streets. He made so much money, he ran out of places to hide it. But one mistake, one fur coat, brought his empire crashing down. This is the story of how Frank Lucas became the king of Harlem, how he outsmarted the Mafia, and how his empire fell apart. Frank Lucas sat ringside at Madison Square Garden, draped in a $50,000 chinchilla coat and a matching hat. Muhammad Ali was in the ring. But the real fight that night wasn't in the arena. It was playing out in the streets of Harlem. That coat wasn't just fashion. It was a statement. And it was the mistake that put Frank on the law enforcement's radar. But long before that moment, Lucas had built an empire worth millions, moving heroin through a pipeline so direct and so pure that even the Mafia couldn't compete. He went from a small-time hustler in North Carolina to controlling the heroin trade in New York City. This is how he did it and how it all came crashing down. Frank was born in 1929 in LaGrange, North Carolina, a place where poverty and racism shaped his early years. He once claimed that the defining moment of his life was watching his cousin murdered by the Ku Klux Klan for allegedly looking at a white woman. That moment stuck with him. It was the day he decided power meant survival. He started with small-time crimes, robbing local businesses, getting into fights, and eventually fleeing to Harlem after setting a rival's house on fire. In Harlem, crime wasn't just a way to survive, it was a business. Frank found a mentor in one of the city's most feared gangsters, Ellsworth Johnson, also known as Bumpy. Johnson was a legend, a man who kept the Italian Mafia at bay while running Harlem's numbers racket. Lucas was learning from him, watching how he handled money, power, and loyalty. Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968, leaving a vacuum in Harlem's underworld. Naturally, the Mafia expected to take full control. However, Frank had other plans. Frank Lucas understood one thing better than anyone else in the drug trade. The key to power wasn't just selling drugs, it was controlling the supply. The heroin flooding the streets of Harlem in the 1960s came from the Italian Mafia, who bought it from middlemen in Turkey and France. By the time it reached New York, it was heavily diluted, often cut with additives like baking soda, quinine, or even talcum powder. Lucas saw an opportunity. Instead of relying on the Mafia's supply chain, he went straight to the source, Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle, a lawless region between Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar that produced some of the purest heroin in the world. Lucas flew to Thailand himself, where he was introduced to Leslie Ike Atkinson, an American Army sergeant who had deep connections with local drug suppliers. Through Atkinson, Lucas met a powerful general in the Royal Laotian Army who agreed to sell him heroin that was 98% pure, something unheard of on the streets of New York. However, the problem was getting it into the US without being detected. Lucas couldn't afford to move heroin through the usual smuggling networks, which were closely watched by law enforcement. Instead, he devised a plan that became legendary, hiding heroin in the coffins of dead American soldiers returning from Vietnam. The theory was simple. Military caskets weren't searched as rigorously as commercial cargo. Some sources claim that false-bottomed caskets were built to conceal the drugs, while others say the heroin was hidden inside hollowed-out compartments and furniture shipped alongside military equipment. With a direct supply line in place, Lucas was now selling heroin that was stronger, purer, and cheaper than anything on the streets. He called it Blue Magic, branding it like a luxury product. While most heroin sold by the Mafia was cut down to 10% purity, Blue Magic remained at 40 to 60% purity, making it more addictive and more lethal. It wasn't just a drug, it was a brand, and users knew they were getting something stronger than anything else available. This purity combined with a lower street price allowed Lucas to dominate the heroin trade in New York. While the Mafia had long been charging $50,000 per kilo, Lucas was buying direct from Southeast Asia for just $4,200 per kilo. Even after shipping and distribution costs, his prices were a fraction of what the Italians could offer, which meant dealers and users flocked to him. At his peak, Lucas was moving 100 kilos of heroin per month, generating revenues that reportedly reached $1 million a day. But with that level of success came attention from both rivals and law enforcement, which meant ultimately his own downfall. Frank Lucas wasn't just making money, he was flaunting it. He bought a $125,000 house in Teaneck, New Jersey, filled with luxury cars and furs. He handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving, played the role of Harlem's Robin Hood, and traveled with an entourage. He was also smart enough to realize that keeping a low profile was key in this business. That is why the Chinchilla coat was such a mistake. Before that, he had avoided attracting too much attention. But that moment he walked into that Muhammad Ali fight wearing a $50,000 coat in front of politicians, celebrities, and law enforcement, he put himself on the map for all the wrong reasons. You see, Frank Lucas didn't just want to take over Harlem's heroin trade. He wanted to cut the Italian Mafia out entirely, and that made him enemies. For decades, the Mafia controlled the city's heroin supply through the infamous French Connection, a smuggling operation that moved heroin from Turkey to France, then into New York through Sicilian mobsters. The Mafia ran everything: the supply, the distribution, and the dealers. If anyone wanted to move heroin in New York City, they either paid them or died. But Lucas wasn't about to pay anyone. He saw the Mafia as nothing more than an overpriced middleman. By going straight to Southeast Asia, he bypassed their entire operation, selling a purer product at a lower price. Suddenly, their customers, street-level dealers in Harlem, were switching to Lucas's heroin because it was more profitable. Of course, the Mafia did not take kindly to competition. You see, Dominic Napolitano and the Lucchese crime family had been making millions off Harlem's drug trade. Lucas's growing empire was eating into their profits, and tensions escalated quickly. The Mafia sent warnings, demanding he fall in line and pay tribute, just like every other drug dealer in the city. Lucas refused. In response, war was on. Italian enforcers started showing up at his stash houses, robbing and killing his men. Of course, Lucas struck back just as hard, using his connections in Harlem's street gangs to fight back. He deployed armed enforcers, many of them former Vietnam veterans who had no hesitation about pulling the trigger. Bodies started piling up. One of the most infamous incidents came when Lucas's men stormed a Mafia-controlled nightclub in the Bronx, where a key Lucchese lieutenant was holding court. Guns were drawn, and the message was clear. Lucas was adamant on winning this war. However, what really cemented Lucas's power was the police. The NYPD and the DEA were already investigating the Mafia's heroin operation, and Lucas's rise actually helped law enforcement. His dominance weakened the Italians just as federal agents were cracking down. Despite all the bloodshed, the Mafia eventually realized they had no choice but to tolerate Lucas and compromise. He was too powerful, too well-connected, and had a direct pipeline they could not touch. Instead of wiping him out, they decided to work around him, shifting focus to other markets while keeping a watchful eye on his empire. You gotta realize, for a black drug lord to outmaneuver the Mafia was unheard of in the 1970s. Lucas did not just beat them in the streets, he beat them in business. But in the end, it wasn't the Mafia that took him down, it was his own greed and the law. As the DEA and the NYPD were cracking down on heroin trafficking, Lucas's operation was too big to be ignored. And it all started with a $50,000 Chinchilla coat. For years, Lucas has stayed under the radar, dressing modestly and keeping his wealth quiet. But the night he walked into Madison Square Garden in a full-length Chinchilla coat and a matching hat, sitting ringside at the Muhammad Ali fight, changed everything. That single moment caught the eye of Agent Roberts. Roberts wasn't sure who Lucas was at first, but a black man sitting among the city's elite, dressed like royalty, raised questions. From that point on, Lucas was a prime target. That coat, a gift from his wife, was the biggest mistake of his career. It was a flashing neon sign that said, "I have more money than I know what to do with." Investigators started looking into his finances, his businesses, and his drug empire. The pressure mounted until law enforcement finally had enough evidence to take him down. In 1975, authorities raided Lucas's mansion and seized $584,000 in cash hidden under his bed. He was arrested and sentenced to 70 years in prison. But Lucas, always a survivor, found a way out. He agreed to cooperate with law enforcement, providing information that led to the arrest of over 100 drug dealers and corrupt cops. His cooperation earned him a reduced sentence, and by 1981, he was free. But of course, someone like Frank Lucas could not stay out of trouble. In 1984, he was caught trying to sell heroin again, and spent another 7 years behind bars. Frank Lucas's story became infamous, especially after the 2007 film American Gangster, where Denzel Washington played him. Though some details were exaggerated, the core of his story remained the same. A man who built an empire by outmaneuvering the mafia, only to be undone by his own greed and arrogance. He spent his later years giving interviews, claiming he had changed, and talking about the consequences of his actions. He died in 2019 at the age of 88. Frank Lucas was a kingpin unlike any other. He didn't just sell drugs, he changed the business. He cut out the middlemen, ran Harlem like a corporation, and became one of the richest drug lords in history. But in the end, like every other crime boss before him, his empire was built on a foundation that could not last. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell.